When talking about genetics, one common question that comes up is, why do harmful alleles stick around? As we have discussed, most traits have a variety of alleles. When we talk about eye color, there are different versions. You could have blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, and so on. These are all different alleles for the same trait. And while most alleles are either beneficial or neutral in effect, there are some alleles that are harmful, particularly when we start talking about genetic illnesses. For example, hemophilia is an illness we've talked about. It is a genetic illness that is passed down that prevents blood from clotting and often results in the death of individuals suffering from it. Tay-Sachs is another similar genetic illness. It is lethal, it kills you before you're 5 years old, and we have no treatment for it. So why do harmful alleles stick around? There are two main reasons. Most are recessive, and something we call the heterozygous advantage. Let's look at each of these in turn. Most harmful alleles are recessive in nature. While there are a few exceptions, we're going to focus primarily on the recessive ones, because that's the bulk of them. Individuals can be carriers. A carrier is an individual with a heterozygous genotype, meaning they contain both a dominant and recessive allele. We call them carriers because they carry the recessive allele but do not express it. This term came up when we originally started talking about genetic illnesses because they can carry the illness but are not themselves affected by it. So they do not suffer from the effects of the recessive allele because they contain a dominant one that is expressed. However, they are able to pass the recessive allele to their offspring. So if you look at the image here, we have two parents that are carriers for an illness of some type, a recessive trait at least of some kind, and that's represented by dark blue. They can have different possible offspring. It is possible both parents will pass the normal dominant allele to a child, in which case the child will not have the illness and will not be a carrier. Both of them could pass the illness onto a child, in which case this child will be homozygous recessive and have the disease. Or it's possible for the child to inherit one normal and one recessive allele, and as a result, we end up with a carrier who is a child, who again will have the illness, but will not express it. So recessive alleles, because they can be hidden, are able to do what we call skip a generation. They can disappear and then in a future generation reappear. Okay? If you look at this pedigree here, we have an individual up here at the top in the first generation, number 1, that suffers from a particular recessive illness. Doesn't matter which one. However, in the second generation, if we look, no one suffers from this illness. No one has it. But in the third generation, it appears again. How did that happen? Well, what we can say with certainty, if this is a recessive illness, these two parents, number 3 and number 4, had to be heterozygous in nature. And down here, this one is homozygous recessive. That's the only way it is expressed. So we've seen an example here of how a recessive allele is able to disappear and then reappear in a generation because of carriers. So anytime you see a pedigree where you have a trait disappear and then reappear after a generation or more, you know you're dealing with a recessive trait and you've got carriers involved. That's your clue. Okay? And also the presence of carriers makes it very likely that harmful recessive traits will remain in the population in the long term. They might disappear for a generation, but they will be back. The other reason that recessive harmful traits stick around is something we call the heterozygous advantage. And I'm going to use a very particular example while illustrating this called sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a blood disorder that results in abnormally shaped red blood cells. Normally, red blood cells are round in shape because of the hemoglobin contained in them. And hemoglobin is responsible for carrying oxygen in the red blood cells throughout your body. Someone suffering from sickle cell anemia, a recessive trait, will have abnormally shaped hemoglobin, which causes the red blood cells to be sickle-shaped, kind of like a crescent moon. This has two problems. First off, sickle cell cells do not hold oxygen as well as normal-shaped red blood cells, so the body is not getting as much oxygen as it normally would. Even more important is what happens when red blood cells are moving through the body. round, normal-shaped red blood cells pass through the arteries and the veins without any problem. But sickle cell blood cells can cause backups and clots at branching points in the arteries, which can result in death. So as you can guess, this is a very serious illness that can often result in the death of an individual at a much younger age than would be expected. Now, I mentioned dominant and recessive. AA, or the A allele, is the normal dominant version that results in a healthy cell. The S allele, on the other hand, is the sickle cell allele, and when occurs homozygous recessive, SS, we end up with someone with sickle cell anemia, the crescent shape. But you'll note we're missing one particular group here, our heterozygote individuals, AS. What would they be? Well, let's take a look at each of the phenotypes and understand why this matters. Someone with a genotype of AA, homozygous dominant, would have normal hemoglobin. Someone with SS, sickle cell anemia, they are going to suffer from the illness. Someone with AS, on the other hand, has what we call sickle cell trait. Someone with sickle cell trait has, you can think of it as a watered down version of sickle cell anemia. For the most part, they have normal hemoglobin, but some of their cells, under certain circumstances, can change shape and turn into the sickle shape. However, because it is such a small number, the immune system is able to remove those cells from the body, and the clogging of arteries and veins becomes much less of an issue. So individuals with sickle cell trait, it's treatable, and they are able to live longer lives than you would expect someone with sickle cell anemia to have. So with these three options, it seems pretty clear that having normal hemoglobin would be an advantage, until we throw another factor into the mix, malaria. Malaria is an illness that is passed by mosquitoes in the tropics around the world. It kills millions of people a year if left untreated. So malaria is a serious concern for people living throughout tropical Asia, Africa, and Central South America. What's interesting is sickle cell interacts with malaria when it enters the body. Someone with normal hemoglobin, AA genotype, does not have any innate malaria resistance. The question of whether when they get malaria, if they get sick or not, and how well they get better, just depends on their immune system. Someone with sickle cell anemia also does not have any natural resistance to malaria. But someone with sickle cell trait, heterozygote individuals, do have an increased resistance to malaria. When the malaria virus comes in and infects the cell, the red blood cell, it changes into a sickle cell, which triggers your immune system to remove it. So people suffering from sickle cell trait who are heterozygous tend to be highly resistant, if not outright immune, to malaria. So what effect does this have on our life expectancy? For people living in the tropics where malaria is an issue, the normal hemoglobin, AA genotype, while they're not affected by sickle cell anemia, they have a high chance of contracting and dying from malaria. Someone who has sickle cell anemia, homozygous for sickle cell, SS, they have a high chance of dying from sickle cell anemia early in life. Plus, they're at risk of malaria. However, someone with AS, sickle cell trait, not only are they resistant to malaria, but they also do not suffer from sickle cell anemia. And so they tend to live a long lifespan. So what we're seeing here is what we call the heterozygous advantage. Someone who is heterozygous in some traits has an unexpected advantage. And that is one of the reasons some of these traits have stuck around for a long time. In an area where malaria is prevalent, getting rid of sickle cell anemia, SS, the sickle cell anemia allele, would not be a good idea because it would make people more prone to being affected and die from malaria. There are other characteristics out there that are similar. In Western European populations, diabetes has become a major concern, and other parts of the world is also becoming an issue. Diabetes is a situation where your blood sugar levels remain much higher than they should be. We'll talk why that is later on, okay, but understand that diabetes causes higher sugar levels. What possible advantage could there be to having higher sugar levels? Well, there is a genetic component to diabetes, and some research was done showing that other species that live in extremely cold environments, one of the ways they resist frostbite and freezing to death is they elevate the amount of sugar inside their blood. And by doing that, they reduce the chances of being harmed by the cold. Now, what's interesting is the populations that are most prone to diabetes in the world happen to come from Northern Europe. Areas, Scotland, Scandinavia, and other areas that were heavily affected by the cold during the last ice age. And there is some clues that diabetes is actually a remnant from an advantage of having higher sugar levels in your blood during the ice age. Today, it causes health problems. But again, it's another example of a heterozygous advantage that while it's harmful in some ways, in others it could be helpful. And these are some of the reasons that we have characteristics hanging around, even though they appear harmful, especially in today's society. They might not always have been harmful, or there might be certain circumstances where they help out. Okay? Hope that answered your questions and you have a better idea of why certain alleles stick around, even though they appear to be bad.